"Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm." The captain's voice crackled over the cabin speakers, steady and professional, while 2 rows ahead a man in a pressed suit laughed a little too loud at a joke that landed on someone else's misfortune. In seat 12A, a tired single father tightened his grip on the armrest so hard his knuckles went white. Across his lap, a small hand found his and squeezed back. The child's eyes were wide, not from the turbulence but from the invisible weight she sensed in her father's chest. The suited man's laughter, sharp, bright, and careless, cut through the hush like glass. "You really brought the little one alone. Big day for a dad, huh?" he said, loud enough for several heads to turn. That man was Michael Harrington. He smiled the smile of someone practiced at winning rooms and swallowing apologies. The father who did not answer at first was David Carter. The child, fast asleep for most of the flight but suddenly alert now, was his daughter, Emily Carter. A nearby flight attendant, already smoothing a linen over a tray, watched with a look that mixed sympathy and the weary knowledge of having seen this dynamic before. That was Sarah Mitchell. From the cockpit came the deeper, calm presence of Robert Ellis, whose voice threaded through the cabin like a promise. Nobody in that moment guessed how quickly a single question, spoken by a captain who had seen thousands of unlikely things in the sky, would rearrange every assumption in the cabin. David had not always been the quiet man at the aisle seat with the worn duffel and the jeans he'd bought second-hand. Once, his life fit a different shape. There had been boots that were polished until the leather sang, nights in hangars that smelled of oil and ozone, a radio call sign that made adversaries check their maps. He had been young, fierce, and certain of a future drawn in straight lines of duty and honor. But life had a way of redrawing lines without consulting anyone. When Emily was born, the maps were folded differently. When his wife's illness took her too early, the line he thought went forward suddenly forked and led to a smaller, lonelier road. He traded missions for morning drop-offs, sorties for soup, promotion orders for PTA meetings, saving pennies and time the way some people keep medals. That was the quiet bravery nobody applauded, the kind that shows up in scraped knees mended with kisses and in overtime shifts taken silently so that rent can be paid. David's choices were simple: keep Emily safe, keep promises, and never make her feel like a lesser part of the world because their family looked different on paper. The sacrifices sat in his jaw like gravel. He had learned to make them look like calm. The flight began like any other business route. Phones dimmed, eyes glazed, strangers surrendering to the peculiar, communal intimacy of being airborne together. Michael Harrington, a man who had made headlines and a small fortune before breakfast for reasons that never required him to ask for help, liked to travel with a kind of audible confidence that filled rows in a way most people would call charisma. He did not mean harm when he made the comment. To him it was banter, a small pleasure of patronage. But toneless compassion is still compassion's absence, and the way his words landed on David felt like a small, public bruise. Emily tugged at her father's sleeve, sensing the shift. She was 9, a fierce child who read maps like storybooks and had inherited her father's quick smile and stubborn jaw. She had learned to interpret the world in sharp lines. You were either the kind of person who lifted others or the kind who watched them drop. Today, she watched Michael with a cautious, appraising curiosity. Then the unexpected happened. A low, metallic shudder shook the fuselage. A light flashed in the cabin and then another, and the hum of the engines carried a different frequency. Not the steady purr of comfort, but something more complex, a chord that suggested trouble. The captain's voice returned, firmer now, asking everyone to stay seated while the crew assessed a technical issue. Faces went pale. A woman near the back whispered a prayer. The cabin's collective breath became a held thing. In the cockpit, Robert Ellis and his first officer worked with a choreography honed by hours of training, but the instrument panel told a story that made both men frown. A partial hydraulic failure that complicated steering, and an electrical system that greeted the crew with frustrating, intermittent refusals. It was the sort of problem that the manufacturer's manuals addressed in calm, dense pages, and the sort that, in practice, demanded cool heads and quick adjustment. Down the aisle, textbooks bristled on laps, and a toddler clutched a teddy as if it could hold the world in place. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," Robert announced, voice measured. "We've experienced an issue affecting some flight systems. We're in contact with ground and will follow their guidance. For now, please remain calm." Then, after a silent breath, he added something that sounded like a figure of speech and became a pivot. "If there's anyone on board with military aviation experience, fighter pilot experience in particular, would you please identify yourself to a crew member?" It was a practical, almost bureaucratic request, more about adding expertise than about heroism, but it landed like a bell. The cabin's air pressed against every heart the way it does just before a verdict is read. A murmur spread. Michael Harrington lifted his chin, and with a small, amused tilt of his head said aloud, "Who on board is pretending to be a superhero?" He chuckled, believing himself secure in the hierarchy of visible success. David's hands, which had been steady as he wrapped a scarf around Emily's shoulders, tightened, then unclenched. For a second he felt the old muscle memory rise like a tide. The crisp radio calls, the way light reflected off metallic visors, the cadence of protocol. He had not told anyone on the flight about those years. It was a part of him he shelved carefully because the world had changed the day his daughter needed him more than those missions did. In the cramped well of his chest, a small, ember-bright thing lit. He owed Emily one more kind of bravery. To stand up when being needed meant stepping beyond the shame of being mocked. He rose and walked to the galley where Sarah, the flight attendant, leaned in and asked, "Are you?" He nodded, and the cabin that had been filled with strangers shifted in its perception of him. "Name and call sign, please," Sarah asked, voice disciplined by procedure. David's voice, when he spoke, was both soft and resolute. He said his name, and then, in a breath that felt like bridging two lives, he offered his old call sign, the one that had been both a badge and a shorthand for responsibility. When David spoke the call sign, a subtle sound moved through the aircraft, a redistribution of weight. Eyes that had been amused or dismissive went very still. The line between the suit and the man at the aisle blurred. It was suddenly not about titles, but about the body of experience carried quietly beneath clothes and circumstance. In the cockpit, Robert's jaw tightened, not from surprise but from recognition and relief. He leaned into the radio and spoke with a directness that carried over the cabin. "David, are you able to assist in the event we have to switch to partial manual procedures and manual override of certain systems?" David replied that he was, that while his academy days were years ago and his current life was different, he had retained the hands-on familiarity with flight principles and emergency calm that only comes from doing. The captain's request had been practical. The answer was simple competence. What followed was neither a movie's combat sequence nor a simplistic Hollywood miracle. It was a measured, disciplined collaboration. The crew acted exactly as trained. The captain guided the plan with authority and patience. And David, for whom the past and present braided in that narrow aisle, became the extra set of experienced hands and eyes in the cockpit, a living repository of techniques whose kernel held under pressure. He helped interpret instrument quirks, suggested procedural contingencies, and relayed critical observations with a clarity that kept fear from turning into chaos. There were moments of white-knuckled anxiety, like when the plane banked gently to compensate for reduced hydraulic response, and moments of near silence so intense you could hear breathing. Emily slept through most of it, safe in the cocoon of her father's arm, waking only when the plane finally began its slow descent toward an airport that had scrambled to be ready. In those tense hours, David's hands did what they had always done. They worked, they steadied, they made small decisions with large effects. After the plane landed on a runway bathed in emergency lights and the clap of ground crews, passengers unbuckled like people surfacing. Applause, the awkward, grateful kind that follows every difficult landing, rose around rows. Everyone processed what had happened in their own tempo. Some made phone calls. Some met loved ones with teary embraces. Some sat, hands in laps, astonished at how quickly normal had become fragile. Michael Harrington, who had spent much of the flight sizing people by their luggage and the gleam of their watches, stepped forward in a way that felt different from his earlier posture. There was no theatricality in his approach, only the empty, uncomfortable truth of being corrected in public by reality. He stopped directly in front of David, and for a moment the whole plane seemed to contract to that small space between them. "I misjudged you," Michael said, and the words were both apology and confession. "I didn't see what mattered, I'm sorry." It wasn't a grand speech. It was the simpler, rarer thing, humility arriving late. What happened then was quietly human. David accepted the apology without triumph. He had carved his dignity in private long before anyone offered recognition. He thought of Emily and of her future, and he wanted her to see not a spectacle of revenge but a model of composure. The captain, Robert, put a gloved hand briefly on David's shoulder, a small, ceremonial gesture of comradeship. And the flight attendant, Sarah, gave a tired, relieved smile that made a wrinkle at the corner of her eye. Passengers moved toward the exits, exchanging stories with the electric intimacy of people who had faced danger together, and then returned to the ordinary tasks of living. For some, the day would be a headline: "A plane makes emergency landing." And for others, it would be an anecdote about a stranger who knew more than he let on. For David and Emily, it was a quiet reclamation. The man who had been mocked was now understood differently, not because he had shouted his past, but because he had answered when needed. The aftermath was not simply a tidy closure. The emotional landscape of David's life remained complex. He was not suddenly wealthy, nor did every door open for him because of one flight. But the experience made visible an internal ledger he had kept for years: the cost of quiet sacrifice and the deep, human currency of competence. People began to notice him in ways that had nothing to do with wearing a suit. An airline staffer offered a free ticket for Emily's next birthday trip. A neighbor who'd been too proud to ask for help offered child care. And an editor at a small magazine reached out for an article about veterans who reweave their lives after service. The most meaningful change was Emily's quiet pride. She watched her father not as the man who arrived late to parent-teacher meetings, but as someone whose life contained a continuity of honor and tenderness. She learned that identities are layered, and that being a parent does not erase the other parts of a person. It can, instead, be the frame in which those parts make sense. Michael's apology changed how he behaved afterward, not necessarily because he was a better man by default, but because his encounter with David forced a reckoning with his own assumptions. In time, he would sponsor a scholarship for single parents in trade schools and would quietly help fund local programs for veterans re-entering civilian life. He did it without fanfare, because he had learned something simple and profound from David that day. True value is not always loudly displayed. The captain, who had been a teacher more than a savior, took the incident to heart as well. He followed procedure to the letter and praised the calm professionalism of his passengers, but he also wrote a letter to the airline praising the crew and identifying ways training could incorporate insights from people who bring less conventional experience to passenger cabins. If the story holds a lesson, it is not a neat moral folded and handed out like a receipt. It is messier and truer. The world is full of people whose greatest strengths are hidden beneath the weight of ordinary life. The rich and the powerful will sometimes mock what they do not understand. The vulnerable will sometimes shrink under that mockery. But emergencies have a way of peeling back public masks and revealing the steady architecture beneath. In the end, David's dignity wasn't restored with a pat on the back or a public award. It was restored by the way his daughter looked at him, eyes shining with the uncomplicated, electric love that makes the hard days possible, and by the quiet acknowledgments of strangers who had seen him stand up and answer the call. He left the plane heavier with relief and lighter with a small, renewed sense of agency. Years later, Emily would keep a photograph of that flight in a frame in her bedroom, not a picture of the landing lights, but of the moment afterward, when a crowd had gathered and a small girl in a worn jacket leaned against her father, the corner of her mouth lifted in a private smile. David would tell the story sometimes, always emphasizing the ordinary parts, the grocery trips, the late nights, the school play he never missed. He liked to say the real heroism was in showing up to the small things every day, because the small things build lives. Michael Harrington, when asked about the incident in a later interview, would say, almost shyly, that the day taught him that the book of a life often has chapters the headlines never read. Captain Robert Ellis would keep a short note in his log about how calm minds and unexpected allies saved a flight, and Sarah Mitchell would tell new hires about the day she learned that a passenger's silence often hides a universe of experience. The plane incident became a story people told for reasons that had less to do with drama and more with recognition. The recognition that courage can be quiet, that parenting is a kind of command that requires a steady hand, and that kindness, whether offered in a moment of crisis or as a small daily act, changes the shape of the world. In the end, the cabin that had once been a place of ridicule became a small, accidental congregation of witnesses to a truth everyone already suspected but seldom saw. People are more than what they carry in their luggage, and a single question asked in the right voice can open the door to seeing someone